Okay, hello everyone. My name is Courtney Walton Mitchell, and I'm a research associate at the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm also fortunate to administer the past 2 funding cycles of the Mitigation Matters research program for the center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the monthly Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and National Science Foundation. This webinar series highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. We're so grateful that you've joined us today for this webinar session on mitigation messaging and planning research from 3 of our Mitigation Matters Award recipients. They will be sharing research focused on risk communication, recovery planning, and the effect of federal recovery funds on mitigation. Again, we thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share some of my slides. So in addition to thanking you for being here, I just want to do a few housekeeping things. First, I want to let you know that the forum is being recorded and the captioned video and presentation slides from today's webinar will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website. That's hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the prior Making Mitigation Work webinars, as well as access to many other free resources. Also, thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, we can offer 1 contact hour of emergency management training through the IAEM certification program. To receive this credit, you're required to attend the entire webinar session today. So please visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under the Trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information. And you can also contact Katie Murphy at Haz Center, that's HAZCTR@colorado.edu for more information on receiving your certificate for attending the webinar today. So today we'll have 3 presentations. Each will be 15 minutes. And we ask that you save questions until the end of the presentations when we will open up the Q&A session. At that time, we'll pull questions from both the chat and the Q&A boxes. Now, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers who are all part of the cohort of recipients for the Mitigation Matters Research Awards. Today, you will hear from Reese Leem on risk communication to motivate disaster risk mitigation, Saima Kaje on pre-disaster recovery planning for public housing in Salt Lake City, Utah, and Maria Watson on the effect of federal recovery funds on mitigation behavior. Before we begin our first presentation, I also again want to encourage you to visit our Natural Hazard Center website. There you can find each of the speaker bios on the webinar page. Also, under the Awards tab, you can access more information about the Mitigation Matters program, and you can read the research reports and research briefs from each of our speakers. I want to thank Reese, Saima, and Maria for sharing their time and insights with us through the webinar and these written reports and briefs. So over to you, Reese. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and encourage you to go ahead and share your slides.
Thank you, Courtney. Hello, I'm Reese Leem. I'm sharing my screen first. Today, I will present my findings on risk communication to motivate disaster risk mitigation. And this is a part of my dissertation project, so I'm very excited to share some of the findings. Natural disaster risks are increasing. By 2050, 1.5 billion people around the world will be exposed to natural disaster risk. There are behaviors, mitigation behaviors that people can take. However, not many people take these mitigation behaviors. Risk communication can help. But how do we know what message works better than others? To close this knowledge gap, I examine preferred information sources and communication channels. the factors that motivate mitigation behaviors. And based on that, evaluating risk communication messages. First, in study 1, I will present 1 and 2, and then move on to 3, evaluating risk communication messages. First, drivers of mitigation behaviors. For effective risk communication, it is important to find and tap the most impactful factors. There are psychological factors that commonly discussed in the literature: risk perception, coping appraisal, social norms, responsibility, and climate change perception. Coping appraisals are individual evaluations to determine whether they can take these behaviors or they can afford it. Or social norms are the social groups' expectation of individual groups' behaviors. I combined these models factors into one model because the literature didn't tell us which factors are more important or impactful than the others. I simultaneously test these factors on 15 mitigation behaviors. The target behavior includes for wildfire and hurricanes and flood, non-structural mitigation, structural mitigation, purchasing fire or flood insurance, having a list of items in case of emergency, and supporting mitigation policies. Study 1 used quantitative surveys in two most federally declared disasters, wildfires and hurricanes and flood, in 3 disaster-prone states: California, Texas, and Florida. Findings: preferred information sources. For hurricanes and flood, people wanted to hear back from weather forecasters, NOAA, and National Weather Service. For wildfires, people want to hear back from local fire department and state fire department. For the factors motivating disaster mitigation behaviors, for mitigation behaviors, social norms, or social groups' expectation of individual group members, or self-efficacy, or whether people can take those behaviors were strongest factors. And for policy support behaviors, it was response efficacy that motivates policy supports. Response efficacy is whether people believe that risk mitigation measures can really lower the risk. However, risk perception, climate change perception, responsibility that are commonly believed that are strongest psychological factors motivating disaster risk mitigation behaviors were not effective in our findings. So based on our studies, implications. Use preferred information sources. For hurricanes and flood risk, weather forecasters, National Weather Service, NOAA was the preferred information sources. For wildfires, local and state fire departments were effective information sources. Use key drivers. For mitigation behaviors, social norms, or social groups' expectation of individual behaviors, or self-efficacy, or making people believe that they can take these mitigation behaviors are important. For make people to support policies, communicating that policy measures will lower the risk is important. However, risk perception, risk knowledge, climate change perception, responsibility were weak, and we need to be very cautious using these factors. Now that we know the drivers of mitigation behaviors, now we are developing and testing effective intervention messages. I used hurricanes and flood in hurricane-prone states. I specifically focus on these 2 target behaviors: purchasing flood insurance and installing water barriers. I developed two types of the messages: social norms messages and coping appraisal messages. And I test them using experiments over 1,000 participants. I modeled ready.gov Facebook posting, and I used professional voiceover to ensure the exposure. First, I developed social norms messages to evaluate them. First, descriptive norm messages, or explaining how how others are already taking mitigation behaviors.
Over 10 million Florida residents have purchased flood insurance.
Second, injunctive norm messages, or how people believe how others think they should take mitigation behaviors using weather forecasters.
All of your local weather forecasters agree that everyone living in hurricane-prone areas should purchase flood insurance.
Third, injunctive norm messages using neighbor.
Your neighbors think you should purchase flood insurance.
Lastly, disapproval rationale messages or social consequences of not engaging mitigation behaviors.
Because if you don't, your damaged home can harm other homes and lower your community's property values.
I test these messages. Participants are exposed to a combination of these messages, and I use statistical analysis to test this effectiveness. Results. Descriptive no messages weren't effective, whereas injunctive no messages using weather forecasters and disapproval rationale messages motivate them to take purchasing flood insurance and installing water barriers. However, injunctive no messages using neighbors was only effective for water barrier context. I also developed coping appraisal messages to evaluate them. First, why message?
Why should I buy flood insurance?
How message?
How can I buy flood insurance?
Third, cost message.
How much does flood insurance cost?
Lastly, can message.
Get a quote for your insurance. You can do it.
I also test these messages. Participants were exposed to a combination of these messages and use statistical analysis. Result. None of these messages were effective. Rather, they discouraged the mitigation behaviors. However, they increased self-efficacy, response efficacy, and resource constraints. Lastly, I also developed vicarious experience messages. Vicarious experience messages is using a model similar to the audience and using a narrative or story format. So in our study, I used, hello, I'm Sam. My partner and I are just like you, living in your state for your years of living. We knew that hurricanes were a threat. And that's how we started the message. Result, vicarious messages were effective for purchasing flood insurance, but not water barrier context. Yet they increased the social norms. Implication, what does this mean? Communicate that others think people should take mitigation measures. And when you do that, use trusted information sources to communicate mitigation needs. Our study found that injunctive norm messages were effective. And trusted information sources can include for flood and hurricane risk, people prefer NOAA or weather forecaster and National Weather Service. For wildfire risk, you can also communicate through local and state fire departments. Second, communicate social consequences of not taking mitigation measures. Our study found disapproval rationale messages were effective. Unlike other health behaviors or environmental behaviors such as smoking or drinking or recycling, people don't have strong opinions on disaster mitigation behaviors. So to tap social norms and encourage them to take mitigation behaviors, we need to communicate social consequences of not taking mitigation behaviors. For example, for flood and hurricane risk, we can communicate that if they don't take these behaviors, they may harm others' home or lower the community's property values. Third, be very cautious when sharing coping appraisal messages, information, and especially in a fact sheet format. Our results says, even though organization may need to share like how or why people take mitigation behaviors or encourage them to take these mitigation behaviors, those information, communicating this information alone in a fact sheet can discourage them to take mitigation behaviors. If you have to share this information, consider using models similar to your target audience in a story format. Our results shows that using story formats can make them more responsive to the messages, and also using the model similar to your target audience can make them more responsive. Conclusion, natural disaster risks are increasing. If we can use risk communication more effectively, we can be one step closer to disaster risk mitigation. Thank you very much. If you have any question, please leave it here and I will pass to our next presenter.
Thank you so much, Reese. As I mentioned, we're going to have a Q&A at the end of the 3 presentations. So I am collecting your comments and questions in the Q&A or the chat, but just please know we'll answer after the 3 presentations have concluded. So over to you, Saima.
Okay. Hi, this is Saima Kajai, and I am a PhD student at the University of Utah, the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning. Today, I will present our ongoing research entitled PreDisaster Recovery Planning for Public Housing in Salt Lake County, Utah. To start with, we evolve pre-disaster mitigation plans and response plans, help planners in order to make decisions quickly in the aftermath of disasters and reduce the private decision-making process uncertainty. Few communities have such forethought to have pre-disaster planning for their communities, and even this engagement will be less if these communities haven't faced any recent major disasters. So this poor planning may cause negative impacts on communities at risk, specifically their socially vulnerable populations such as public housing residents. Our literature review shows that while research on post-disaster recovery policy has grown in recent years, we have less focus on pre-disaster planning for at-risk communities. Even less attention has been paid to pre-disaster planning for public housing recovery. However, these cohorts of community are highly dependent on governmental assistance, and their recovery is a function of local disaster housing plans and policies, and these policies decides for them where they can go in the event of disaster and when they can return. So we decided to focus on these gaps in literature, and we started our research questions with 2 main questions: whether areas at risk of disaster with no experience of a recent major disaster are prepared for public housing recovery, and what are their challenges and opportunities to do such planning. We chose Salt Lake County, that is situated in state of Utah, and it has 16 cities with 1 million of population. We chose this county because, according to the latest census report, Salt Lake County is one of the fastest growing region in the country, and their population will increase 55% in next 50 years. So this community is also is a white majority of the population, and they are homeowners. However, we have 1/3 of renters, that around 46% of them are rent burdened. This means that affordable housing is a critical issue for this region, even in the regular time and with overall economic prosperity. Also, this county is located in Wasatch region. It means that earthquakes are a major natural threat to people of this county. Wasatch region has a high chance of getting earthquake with 6 magnitude and larger, and also has 93% of chance of being hit by 5 magnitude earthquake and larger within next 50 years. And with regards to the median age of the county, that is 29 years old, that is pretty young. We can predict that people in this county may face a major earthquake during their lifetime. That we have one major earthquake with magnitude of 5.7 in March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic in this county. So this county has a 7 magnitude earthquake scenario that help us to predict that we will have nearly 263,000 individuals that are expected to be displaced in the event of an earthquake, and around 53,000 of them will need shelter immediately. That includes public housing residents. But giving you a background about Public Housing Authority in Salt Lake County, it has been established in 1970. It's a large-size housing authority that served 3,000 of households that as of our research date, 430 of them are public housing residents, and more than 2,000 of them are Section 8 voucher users. That majority of them are residents that are extremely low income. It means that their annual income is less than 30% of area median income. The methodology that we applied for this research was qualitative analysis. We did it in 2 steps. The first steps was archival research, that we looked through documents, including public housing plans, hazard mitigation plan, disaster response plans, and pre-disaster recovery plans that has been adopted by Salt Lake County and its constituent cities. During this archival research, we look for policies and plans that address public housing residents in the county, and what institutional arrangements they consider for this cohort of community in the aftermath of disaster. And then we had interviews with key informant interviews, around 10% at 10 local officials that are working in different sectors such as emergency management, housing authorities, housing development plans, and recovery planners at different levels of state, county, and city. We found their names during our first step and also with the help of snowball sampling, and we asked some questions from them about the resources that they need for planning for this cohort of community for their recovery, and what their barriers and needs, and what have they done for this cohort of community in pre-disaster era. Then we did a thematic analysis of our findings and transcription. And we outlined 3 major themes as motivation, challenges, and opportunities for pre-disaster planning for public housing recovery. Our findings shows that the Salt Lake County doesn't have any standalone plan for housing recovery, for general housing recovery and public housing recovery. And we found that temporary shelters are discussed as a part of other plans like emergency management operation plans or emergency management plans. And during our interviews, we heard from housing authorities that they have some assessments, some predictions of how and where displaced people could go in the event of a major earthquake, but they don't have any assessments of how many people may be displaced, how many public housing residents may be displaced in the event of earthquake. We also found that there is no planned shelter needs assessment for public housing residents for their recovery, and there is a lack of coordination and cooperation between housing authorities in the county and other agencies that work with housing people in the aftermath of disasters. We also heard in our interviews that the pandemic and current major events that happened in Salt Lake County, such as windstorms and wildfires, help them to increase more motivation to plan for socially vulnerable groups, because they found that they haven't addressed them and their vulnerability as they should have been. In our findings, we found some barriers for pre-disaster planning and preparedness for public housing recovery. We found that there is no awareness of the greater impact of disaster on these cohorts of community, and lack of motivated leaders among public housing authorities are one of the other barriers, because some of them don't know how to help this cohort of community in case of major disasters, and they need some help from other housing authorities to show them the way to help them. And we also found that they have not had big disaster experience, so this is a major barrier for them in order to help plan for this cohort of community. And funding, as always, is a major barriers for them to have such plannings, and limited the resources that they have cause obstacles for them to have this forethought for this cohort of community. But in our interviews and our plan reviews, we found some opportunities for pre-disaster planning for this cohort of community, such as we found some small-scale local plans that housing authorities have in order to help public housing residents in case of fires in structures and other events and crises in their structures. They have some planning for keeping communication or keeping power for senior occupied apartments. And they also mentioned that learning from the current experience of pandemic and recent earthquake, Magna earthquake, increased awareness of their vulnerability of these residents, and force them to have some flexibility in regulations during the emergency. For example, after Magna earthquake, they housed some mobile homes residents that were affected by the earthquake in their public housing units without considering those rigid criteria, and they said they can have some flexibility in the case of a major disaster for public housing residents. In order to conclude our findings, we want to say that Salt Lake County as an at-risk community is generally not prepared to provide housing for their public housing residents in the aftermath of disasters. And this not being prepared means a high number of displaced families and staying displaced in the event of disasters. So we can conclude that our findings can act as a call for action in at-risk communities to do preparedness planning for this cohort of community by preparing joint plans with other housing agencies in the community, engaging diverse communities into planning processes, and dedicating some funding sources for such activities also. And in this regards, educating public about mitigation savings and highlighting the importance of recovery of this cohort of community can help us to have preparedness planning for public housing residents, and we can review existing response and recovery protocols for this cohort too. And also, we have some directions for future studies. We suggest to focus on other communities that have risk of disaster, but they haven't any current experience of major disaster, in order to outline the potential gaps in such communities and gather more information about barriers to have preparedness plan for these residents, and also focusing on collecting and analyzing post-disaster recovery cases for public housing residents around the US in order to help and educate housing authorities in other communities to consider costs and benefits of preparedness planning for this cohort of community. At the end, I want to acknowledge National Hazard Center's Mitigation Matters for supporting this project, and also these are my contact information for further information. for your information. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Saima. Just to reiterate, please continue to drop your questions in either the chat or the Q&A. We will address those at the end. And I assure you, any questions we don't have time for, we will also follow up with written responses, and these will be posted to our website. So now, without further delay, we'll go to our final presentation. Maria, over to you.
Thanks. Can you all see my screen? Okay. All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Maria Watson. I'm a research assistant professor at Texas A&M University, soon to be assistant professor at the University of Florida, starting in a week. So today I'm going to be talking about research conducted by myself and COU on mitigation behavior in recovery fund recipients and whether those funds affected that mitigation behavior. And I do want to take the moment to thank FEMA, NSF, and the Natural Hazard Center for funding this research. So I want to start off with two things that most of us in the audience know. The first is that keeping development out of floodplains, surge zones, and other areas of risk of environmental hazards is important in reducing and mitigating the effect of those hazards on our communities. We know that disasters happen at the intersection of environmental events, the built environment, and our social systems. We also know that disaster recovery spending is increasing for a lot of reasons. Hazards are becoming more frequent, more intense due to climate change. You know, we just got that report this week. And we also continue to build in hazardous areas despite this first bullet point. And these two things are related. There's some research that suggests that recovery funds may exacerbate people's location decision-making, given that a lot of funding, such as insurance, gets used to build back existing infrastructure. There's also this idea that because disaster assistance can take the form of loans, that the additional debt, even if it is a small amount or these kind of low interest loans, may have a detrimental effect on recovery. So I've done a lot of research on small businesses. So, you know, the business case in particular got me thinking about this. Some of the literature on business recovery talks about how loan-based assistance may cause businesses to fail later on, particularly for those small businesses with kind of marginal profits. But this can also mean that the business has fewer resources to adapt or move from their current location after a disaster event. And this ability or inability to move has consequences for small business survival. This is a paper I recently published looking at survival differences between businesses that received an SBA loan after Hurricane Ike and a similar control business that did not. And these businesses were paired on their characteristics such as size, ownership, and damage. And I found that businesses that moved from their original location were much more likely to survive than those who stayed. You can see on the slide here that actually businesses that moved had odds of survival that were 3.9 times higher than that similar control business, you know, in terms of size, sector, those kinds of things, that remained in their original location. And so this kind of ties into what Saima just talked about. Businesses need to be able to adapt to changing conditions. And we know that, you know, there's a lot of population displacement that can occur after disasters, especially with, you know, inadequate housing recovery, which can affect the success of the business. And so this issue is of course important for businesses, but that particular analysis left me with a lot of questions that this research is trying to get at a little bit more. So of course, this previous research looked at the effect of loans on survival and moving on survival, but not whether loans affected moving. So what is the relationship between those two variables? Are businesses receiving loans more likely to move or less likely? And I wanted to know whether additional debt, again, even if it's that low interest or kind of minor addition of debt, would cause similar problems for households in terms of the cost burden of moving, thinking about compounding, maybe multiple mortgages and high rents. So for this project, we're looking at two specific research questions. The first, do SBA, Small Business Administration, recovery loans encourage or discourage residential or business mobility in hazardous areas? And two, a little bit more broadly, what factors influence business and residential location decisions for those located in hazardous areas? And so for this research, we're going to use the case of Galveston County, Texas. Galveston County has experienced two major hurricanes in the last couple decades. So 2008 had Hurricane Ike, and 2017 had Hurricane Harvey. You can kind of see on the slide here, Ike got more surge. It was a little bit more of a surge event. So you see more of the loan approved properties along the island. So this kind of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this bottom part is Galveston Island, and this kind of top part is more the mainland area, and Houston is right above it. So you see more kind of surge-related properties from Ike. Hurricane Harvey, a lot of us remember, is more of a rain event. So we see more damaged properties up near Houston, and a little bit more spread out across the county. And so after 2008, there were about 2,500 home loans approved after Hurricane Ike, 500 business loans. After Hurricane Harvey, there were 3,000 home loans and 260 business loans approved. And kind of these loan properties were kind of our sample frame for which we do the rest of the research. So initially, we had planned on going door to door in Galveston to recruit people for in-depth interviews, but we did have to change our methodology due to COVID happening pretty soon after we got this grant. So we used instead postcards for interview recruitment, and we also decided to add a few survey questions. We weren't sure how willing people would be in doing interviews, so we wanted to make sure we captured at least a few things through those postcard-based surveys. And so you can see an example here of our postcard recruitment. We sent out 3 waves of about 900 postcards. So because businesses have kind of a higher turnover, we used the full population of businesses receiving the loans. And if you remember, there were fewer businesses that received loans. And then once we hit that, we did a random sample of the homes that received loans after that to reach our 900. We also did expect our response rate to be low due to COVID and due to the postcard-based recruitment. So we did also want to add a quantitative component. So we used parcel data to help kind of validate some of the findings that we're seeing with the survey, as well as kind of increase our sample a little bit. And we're also in the process of conducting these interviews. We have 27 households and 9 businesses that agreed to talk with us in more depth about their aid experience and decision-making. And so I look forward to sharing those findings once we're finished with those this month. Okay. So getting into our findings, I'm going to start us off with some descriptive statistics from the parcel data, that more quantitative data, to get a sense of how many businesses and residences moved or changed ownership after Ike and Harvey, and what the characteristics of those groups were a little bit more broadly. So after Hurricane Harvey, 551 single-family residents that received an SBA disaster loan changed ownership, and so that's about 19% of the sample in the first 3 years after the event, so between 2017 and 2020, whereas about 2,300 residences had the same ownership in 2020 compared to 2017. After Hurricane Ike, 308 single-family residences that received an SBA disaster loan changed ownership, which was about 13% of the sample. In those first 3 years up to 2011, whereas 2,000 residences had the same ownership in 2011. Loan amount, damage, and resources, you can kind of see our variables there on the left, were summarized for each group to see whether there were any notable differences. We didn't do any t-tests yet, but we do plan to. For single family residences, higher value loss from the hurricane, lower improvement values, so kind of that initial value of the structure, and higher loan amounts characterize the group that changed ownership. And these differences, as you can see, were a little bit more pronounced after Hurricane Ike and Hurricane Harvey. The groups were a little bit less different in Hurricane Harvey. And so looking at businesses, after Hurricane Harvey, 12 businesses that received an SBA disaster loan moved to a new location, and that was about 9% of the sample. And that was actually between 2017 and 2020, so the 3 years. For Ike, 60 businesses moved to a new location, but we actually, the time frame is a little bit different. So we actually recorded those in 2017 compared to 2008. So a little bit longer time frame for moving there, which is maybe why we see more that moved. There's 60 that moved, which is about 24% of that sample. Businesses that moved were more likely to be younger, more damaged, and approved for higher loan amounts. They were also more likely to have survived long-term after the hurricanes, which is what I presented in kind of the third earlier slide. Results for business size were inconsistent across the events. Larger businesses were more likely to stay in place after Harvey, but were more likely to move after Ike. Interviews, I hope, will help clarify whether kind of the recovery context, whether maybe people were just moving off the island compared to kind of this more mainland effect from Hurricane Harvey, or if maybe this is just kind of a product of our lower sample size. We'll have to kind of tease that out a little bit in the future. Now, looking at our survey results, we got approximately 18 business surveys returned and 51 household surveys returned. And from the parcel data, we saw between 9 and 24% of businesses and households moving after the events. But the survey shows that more have at least considered it. So you can see here that 32% of both households and businesses have considered permanently moving. Businesses and households were similar in their response. Whether they had considered moving, both of them were around 32% had considered, 68% had not. And we also asked whether disaster assistance affected the decision to move or stay. And so there's that slash there because there was a display logic depending on whether they had moved or stayed. And so we do see here that disaster assistance did play a role in that decision-making process. Disaster assistance seemed to affect household decision-making a little bit more. 32% of households said that disaster assistance did affect their decision-making, whereas 19% of businesses said the same thing. And then this survey question was actually modified from Yu Zhao and colleagues' Hurricane Sandy survey. I have the reference to their publication down there in 2018, using kind of a similar question to look at how businesses and households made the decision to recover in the same neighborhood. And for our survey, we're just modifying it slightly to see what are the ranked importance of each of these factors in the decision to move or stay from their current location. And so the top factor for businesses and residents illustrates the connection between the two. So businesses ranked their existing customer base as most important, and residents cited proximity to their job. So kind of these more economic reasons. Both businesses and residents listed personal ties to their location as the next most important factor. So kind of this social reasons. And for residents, it was specifically proximity to family. And then disaster risk was actually the third highest ranked, perhaps due to the fact that those two hurricanes have happened over the last decade or two. Okay. And so lastly, we asked whether residents and businesses used their funds to mitigate against a future hazard. So SBA does allow you to increase the amount of your disaster assistance loan up to 20% of your verified physical damage to make mitigation improvements. But just based on the survey, it's unclear whether that was what was used in these cases. It's also possible that some of these respondents were more or less forced to bring their structure up to new building codes and elevations due to their damage. Again, this is something that we can tease out with the interviews this month. I'm also pretty interested in asking whether people were aware of this mitigation program kind of funds extension from SBA, and whether increasing awareness of that program would be worthwhile, maybe using findings from Reese's research for that. Okay. So to summarize, not all recipients of disaster recovery assistance remain in their same location after an event. Survey data indicates that decisions are driven by economic and personal reasons, but also by disaster risk. Disaster assistance itself did have an effect on some businesses and residents' decision to remain at their current location or move to avoid a future hazard. For future work, we want to statistically test whether groups that moved or stayed at their original location differ significantly based on amount of damage, structural characteristics, and demographic and economic characteristics, those variables that you saw more descriptively presented earlier. In addition, while the study examined homes and businesses that occupied a structure that was approved for an SBA loan, this is, of course, just a subset of the overall population. So we would love to be able to do some similar matching methods to compare moving behaviors in disaster assistance recipients to those not receiving disaster assistance. And kind of along those lines, location decisions, moving decisions are extremely nuanced and extremely personal. So the interviews are going to be really important going forward for us. We kind of see this research as a pilot study. We hope to get a larger response rate going forward with more targeted questions based on what we do learn from these more in-depth interviews. And lastly, in terms of policy implications, the survey questions, and especially the ranking question, show that businesses and households are very similar in their decision-making. Business owners are making decisions, as an individual with a full social life, and households are making both personal and economic decisions. So the more that we can coordinate our efforts to take advantage of the very tight relationship between those two sectors, housing and business, the better. So, just thinking about buyout programs, including commercial properties in buyout programs. When we look at residential buyouts, consider where those people are working, consider work locations, and making sure that we more holistically plan for moving out of these hazardous areas. And lastly, leveraging recovery funds, is something we do already, but it is such an important tool for increasing mitigation. More flexible funding with fewer restrictions can make it easier for businesses and residents to mitigate and make sure that we're better prepared in the future. And so, yeah, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat or whatever, but here's my contact information, and thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria. At this time, we want to go ahead and open up for questions. I realize many of you have already put lots of good questions in the Q&A in the chat. And Reese, thank you. I see you're already answering some of those as well. If you haven't already, please go ahead and drop in your questions, again, in either Q&A or chat. And if you could just label who it's for in case there's any ambiguity. So I've picked a few of these up, and we have about 10 minutes or so. I'm gonna just start with a question for each of our panelists that's already been asked. So Reese, this is a bit of a two-part question. Do you know why sharing coping information in a fact sheet was viewed negatively? And could you share a few more examples of the messaging types?
Yes, of course. So first question, why coping appraisal information wasn't effective? It was a surprising finding for me too, because a lot of agencies are using coping appraisal information, or like how, why, or encouraging people can take these behaviors, or the mitigation behaviors aren't expensive or doesn't take too long. So it was very surprising. My guess is that humans are more socially programmed, much more than we think, and we are not rational animals. Another guess is that maybe knowing the fact that like what we can do or how we can do is one thing, but then really wanting to take those mitigation behavior is another. So the realization is that we are very complex than we thought, but just using the fact sheet it helps people understand that they can take these behaviors, or those behaviors are effective, but it doesn't make them to want or motivate them to take those behaviors. So these are the different things. And for those who wants to see more messages, let me share those. Let me share my screen so that you can see. And my sincere apologies. During my presentation, I ran through those messages. So let me share it again. So for social norms messages, I developed and tested 4 different messages. For descriptive norm messages, the intention is to show how others are taking those behaviors already. So over 10 million Florida residents have purchased flood insurance. Injunctive norm messages is to show how others think they should take those behaviors. So, and then we can use different information sources or messengers. So for this message, we use weather forecasters. All of your local weather forecasters agree that everyone living in hurricane-prone areas should purchase flood insurance. And weather forecasters is one of the most preferred information sources based on our study 1. The second message, injunctive norm message using neighbor, we use neighbors. So most of your neighbors think you should purchase flood insurance. And the tricky part is that when we run the survey, not many people are not taking mitigation measures, or they don't believe taking mitigation others think others should take mitigation measures. So that's the tricky part, because we don't want to we want to stay true. And I was torn how to develop the message, because we want to stay true, but also it is unethical to we just use fictional information. So because local weather forecaster agree this fact, we can use this. Also, I use the actual number of residents rather than percentile of residents. So by using this way, we can stay true, but also tap descriptive norms or injunctive norms. Lastly, disapproval rationale messages is if you don't purchase flood insurance, your damaged home can harm others' homes and lower your community's property values. So this message is to tap social norms, but in order to tap social norms, we need to hit social approval or disapproval. And to hit social disapproval, we need to increase that it will, if they don't engage this behavior, it will harm others, which lacks in mitigation behaviors usually. For why, how, cost, and can messages, these are very more simple or more direct compared to social norms messages. Why messages is why should they buy flood insurance, how messages, how they can buy flood insurance, cost messages, how much does flood insurance cost, and can messages is more about encouraging, you can do it. Does it answer your question?
Thank you so much, Reese. I think we'll, in the interest of time, we'll go over to a question for Saima. So here's a question that I thought was interesting, and again, just help us to clarify if this is understanding the populations that you were working with. It seems you had two populations in your study. Some tenants lived in public housing, while the majority had a voucher they could take to the private market. Did you analyze these populations' impact separately or differently?
Yeah, thank you for these great questions. For this research, we focus on residents who use physical public housing units, and it will be a great idea to add different negative impacts on these two populations in our future study, because it's an ongoing research for us. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. And this is one for Maria. How do you work to keep bias out of your leveraging your recovery funds planning?
Yeah, I just put a comment in the chat because I want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. If you wouldn't mind clarifying what you mean by bias, but I can say broadly, you know, this is why you know, you don't make decisions, I guess, as a single unit. You engage in public participation, engage in some of these interviews and understand, you know, how people are experiencing the disasters and what their issues and those kinds of things were, so that you're not, you know, imposing your own sets of bias. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering that question correctly, but I guess that would be my broad answer. Thank you.
Great, thank you. In the interest of time, I'm wondering if I'll just open it up to the three of you. And again, we will answer all of the questions and comments in written form and post those to our website. So thank you for the great questions, and please feel free to keep them coming until we close out the webinar. And of course, thank you for the presenters that have already been answering those in real time. But I just wanted to say, you know, we have your final reports on our website, and we also have the research briefs that have policy implications. Did any of you want to either elaborate on the policy implications or comment further on next steps and what you'd like to see with your research? I'll open that up for any of the three of you. Saima, Reese, Maria. Anything else you'd like to say about the policy implications of your work or next steps in terms of additional research questions that your findings might suggest?
Yeah, I can start because I think, yeah, for this research, those two things are related. I think in order to have a little bit more targeted policy implications and findings, we really do need to expand what we've already done in terms of, you know, talking to more people. Hopefully when it becomes, you know, more safe to go visit in person, try to expand both, you know, targeted in terms of the types of businesses and residents. I saw a comment in the chat, you know, about getting both renters and, you know, owners, both for businesses and housing, and making sure we're really getting, you know, a good stratified sample, I guess, in that sense, in terms of making sure we're getting, you know, all different perspectives that we can for this research. And so that way, maybe we can have a little bit better and more targeted policy implications. So I guess that's where we would go next moving forward with this research.
Thank you.
Yeah, for our research, we suggest as a policy implications about that the communities at risk can plan on having joint plans with other housing agencies in order to recovery of these cohort of community, and also investing more on educating public in terms of the great impact of disaster on this community and how their recovery can impact the resilience of their communities at all. And also for future studies, we are thinking about collecting and gathering those policies and plans that other communities apply for this cohort of community when they faced a major disaster, like coastal regions, in order to gather some information for housing authorities and to help them to plan for these residents. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And Reese, did you want to make any concluding remarks to this effect?
Yes, so just 3 things. Use trusted information sources, communicate social consequences of not taking mitigation measures, and try to use story format and the spokesperson that are similar to the audience.
Great, thank you. So again, Reese, Saima, and Maria, thank you so much for sharing this important work. We also want to again thank FEMA and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible. Thanks to all the participants for joining us today. And we just have a few brief announcements before we close. So first, please do access our website to learn more about the research that was shared today. Again, there are long form research reports and there are research briefs available for each of the speakers. And also please remember to contact hazcenter@colorado.edu, that's HAZCTR@colorado.edu, if you plan to earn a contact hour towards your CEUs for emergency management training and certifications through IAEM. On a final note, we're going to take a short pause from the Making Mitigation Work webinar series, but I encourage you to check out the past webinars, and you can again access all of those recordings as well as this one on our website. And finally, I encourage you to sign up for updates so that you can receive notifications on future webinars and training sessions. And we'll be popping that information in the chat as well. Again, there are lots of good free resources on our website. So for now, on behalf of the entire team at the Natural Hazard Center, we want to again thank all of the panelists and all of the participants for joining us today.